Well, it looks like the situation in Australia is finally getting the attention it deserves. Uh, Australia, don't know if I would go so far as to call it a test case for the rest of the world. I don't think that the Davos folks, are sitting around, a big board table at Bilderberg and said, "Ah, yes, Australia, that's where we'll crack down the most, and we'll see how the lemmings react, and if it goes over well, we'll do the same thing everywhere else." I don't think it was quite that much. I think that these sorts of things do happen organically to a certain extent. I think that, you've got brutal, ruthless, anti-human politicians all over the world, and it just so happens that in Australia they're particularly vile. And it looks like, finally, the Australian government is beginning to overplay its hand, which to me is always what I'm looking forward to. Whenever you see acts of government overreach, at a certain point there is just, there's a law of physics in in both economics and sociology, and what goes up must come down. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and I wouldn't necessarily say equal and opposite in the social sciences. I don't think that's necessarily the case, although it can be. There's no mathematical formula for trying to predict human behavior. You can't predict the intensity of human behavior, but you can predict the direction. That's why the pendulum analogy is so useful for politics. The more extreme a regime moves in one direction, they're building up a lot of potential energy for things to swing back in the other direction hard and fast at some point in the future. Now, maybe that takes decades, maybe it takes 70 years, in the case of the Soviet Union. And even in that case, there was not an equal and opposite reaction. It's not like they went from totalitarianism to, near anarchy. Although they had an anarchy of a sort, they went from totalitarianism to a relatively greater level of freedom. But I would not say that Russia by 1995 was as free as it had been in 1905. So I don't think that Australia will necessarily ever go back to the time of 2019, but at some point, especially as hard and fast as the authorities have been pushing the people in Australia, there will be a backlash. There will be a movement back in the other direction in the hearts and minds of many of the people in that country. And I think we're starting to see that now. It seems, well, it is every day. We get lots and lots of new videos of the cops abusing people in the country, and people really just being exasperated and fed up. There is a very powerful video of a man, being held on the ground by like 8 cops for, walking in the park without his mask, and he claims he was smoking, and, "Oh, I have 2 masks in my pocket, 2 masks." And he really just, he didn't sound like desperate or scared. He just sounded annoyed and fed up. I mean, he said, "What? I was smoking. Can't have my mask on while I'm smoking. I've got 2 masks in my pocket. What more do you want me to do?" The guy really just, he was at wit's end. And eventually, that's how people get. But I still don't think that this is going to be a majority of the country. I don't see there being some sort of political, uprising against this. It's not like I don't think that there's going to be some anti-lockdown party that comes out of this and just completely disrupts the Australian political system. It's clear that the biomedical police state has bipartisan support, just like it does in so many countries around the world. And that's a big problem, because when it comes to opposing bipartisanship, there's not much that people can do other than openly resist the regime. And that's when things, get dangerous. But at the end of the day, people in Australia have already been disarmed. It's not like they're going to fight back and overthrow their government, unless they just had that many people out in the streets, to where, the government felt compelled to resign. That's what happens in third world countries when the CIA organizes mass protests. The tin pot, or even the elected government in some cases, says, you know what, hey, we're out of here. No good. It happened in Portugal, I believe in a non-CIA induced way, pretty organically back in the early 70s, or just a bunch of people walking out in the streets, and some folks in the military kind of went, maybe the jig is up, and maybe we shouldn't shoot these protesters. And the guy in charge said, well, I guess I'm out of here. Mass civil disobedience can work if it does happen, en masse. But you look at France with the Yellow Vests, they had mass civil disobedience. They had mass riots. And Macron is still here. Politics is a game of perceptions. The guy who's in charge it's not like there's some special superhuman. And, we know that, it's not like how it was back during the days of the divine right of kings, where people thought that the king literally was a demigod, and so you couldn't oppose him. He was in a very real way above you as a human being. But nobody has any illusion about that these days. People know that folks like Macron, or Scott Morrison in Australia, they're just men. And so the way for those men to lose power is for people to stop listening to them and to no longer recognize them as their leader. And while the Australian state is being relatively delegitimized as a result of their heavy-handed policies, the Australian government had an incredibly high level of legitimacy in the eyes of its citizenry prior to this whole debacle. And so even if people are rapidly losing faith in the state is starting from such a high level of acceptance that it's going to take a lot more time for enough people to really grow to resent the state. Revolutions don't happen overnight. And this sort of state of affairs could go on for years. Because at the end of the day, it's sort of a game of patience. Macron waited out the Yellow Vests. He bet, hey, I'm going to ignore them and not give in, and I think in time they'll fade away. And that's what happened, basically, with the Yellow Vests. Morrison can do the same thing in Australia if he wants, and the only way that anything is going to happen is if the right-thinking people of Australia win that game of chicken. They can't just throw their hands up and resist for a few weeks. They can't say, I'm not going to get my shot for a little while, and then eventually give in. They have to dig in and really, wait this one out. Dig in for the long haul. Because there's just not enough of their fellow citizens who are on board with them. The media is trying to smear the construction workers as a bunch of Nazis, even though I think, they're union members. That's probably like a labor voting bloc. But with a blue-pilled population like Australia's, it's going to take a long time for their Nazis name-calling to really lose potency. I think that there's no state where this is more apparent than Israel, where people really do have an attitude that, hey, if I challenge the state, that's basically the same as siding with the Arabs, and I would be a bad Jew if I show too much opposition to the state of Israel. That's the problem with a nation state, is people are way too emotional, and their loyalty to the state is tied to their personal identity. People feel like they're giving up a part of themselves when they stand up to the state, rather than recognizing the state at the outset for what it is, which is merely a gang of thieves. It's true that ever since the French Revolution, the state has wrapped itself in the banner of patriotism and fraternity. But at the end of the day, the state is still the state, whether you have Louis XIV in charge or you have an elected president in charge. The state does not care for you. They see you as cattle. And frankly, as Hans Hermann Hoppe argues, the king probably valued his cattle much more than the average modern-day elected politician, because you see the king looked at the cattle as his property, as something that he could bequeath to his heirs. And so he wanted to preserve the capital value of his estate, that being the whole country. He wanted the country to succeed and to be wealthy, because you want to foster people who you can tax and yourself derive a high standard of living from. A king who rules over a poor country doesn't have that much wealth to plunder. And if he takes too much for himself, then his children will be left with nothing. So he's incentivized to try and grow the wealth of the nation, to try and make people more successful so that he himself can steal more money from them. But the elected politician who's in office for a mere 4 years or 5 years or whatever this term may be, looks at it as, hey, I'm not going to be able to give all this wealth of this state to my children. I need to plunder as much as I can in the time that I'm in office, and so that I can leave that to my children, so that I can, because I don't own the state. I'm like a renter. It's really a tragedy of the commons when nobody really owns the state must inevitably decay, which is both a positive and a negative thing. It's negative in that we're governed terribly, but it's positive in that that the democratic state likely will not last forever and will eventually cannibalize itself. And at that point, you will have an opportunity to rein in a better state of affairs. So, with that said, it's going to be a long fight, but I have hope for the people of Australia. It's good to see at least some resistance. A couple weeks ago, I talked about the country, and to me, it just seemed hopeless because there really wasn't anyone standing up. But now that's starting to change. So, I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.